position of your closing submission then. Were you suggesting not reading out appendices A and B? Was that?
Save insofar as they concern a response to Mr. Dubin's point on the RTRA.
Yes.
Simply for time, and because it's all there insofar as there is only, if my stressing solicitor could remind me, one small point to make, essentially agreeing with Mr. Dubin, but going further, or in relation to I say the non-applicability of the Human Rights Act, because it's not a public authority. But that's just a small point which I will remember to add.
I'm happy you proceed on that basis then. Thank you.
This document sets out the company's submissions in relation to the legal framework for the application, the evidence, and that application of the statutory test to that evidence in that order. By an application dated 12th July 2024, which was revised in November 2024 to offer greater concessions to regular users, as well as pushing back implementation of the inflationary increases. By 1 year, the company seeks to vary its tolls for use of the ferry and to reintroduce a toll for the use of the road. The objectives of the application are to better ensure that the income from the tolls rises in line with inflation, thereby better matching increases in the company's expenditure, to ensure that sufficient reserves are built up to replace the current ferry at the end of its serviceable life in 2034, and to protect regular users from significant increases insofar as possible, while also avoiding unsustainable discounts, or by funding high discounts through higher single fare costs, yet higher single fare costs, and to seek to allow a reasonable return on investment to the ferry owners, the investors. The company submits that the evidence demonstrates that the application is necessary, that the 2021 order needs to be revised, that is to say, what is meant by that, a new order needs to be passed for the ferry company to survive beyond 2034, ferry service, I should say, to survive beyond 2034, and the proposed tolls are very reasonable and no more than adequate to meet the financial requirements set out in the 1954 Act. Still less are they likely to be substantially more than adequate to meet those needs. It is agreed with the consortium that the ferry is essential to the local communities served by it, but that is why its future must be preserved. The evidence demonstrates that the new ferry will not be capable of being bought unless the tolls rise beyond the 3% already permitted in the order, the 2021 order. If a new ferry is not capable of being bought, that would be disastrous for the local community. So the point there is, sir, that whilst Mr. Dubin proposes, as if it were a solution, increases of 3% per annum, that is already provided for in the 2021 order. The evidence that you have heard is that in the absence of unrealistically high increases in the traffic volumes, that would be insufficient. Those 3% increases would be insufficient to be able to afford the ferry by 2034. Mr. Dubin made his submission without any acknowledgement of that central fact. That follows from Mr. Thomas's evidence that even the consortium's most optimistic projection of increases of 0.5% per annum would be insufficient to be able to afford the new ferry in 2034. Mr. Thomas was not challenged on that point. Moreover, Mr. Clark, witness for the consortium who addressed these points of this nature, agreed that he was unable, or stated that he was unable to disagree with them. So it is rather surprising that Mr. Dubin, for the consortium, having heard that evidence and having stressed a very considerable length the importance of the ferry service to the local community, which fact is not in doubt, nevertheless proceeded to recommend to USER a solution which the evidence indicates would not result in the ferry service being continuable. Sorry, so that was an ad-lib to respond to what Mr. Dubin had said just today, because I had not had time to take account of his written submissions when I sent mine. Mr. Dubin suggested there was a conflict between, on the one hand, building up the FRR, and on the other hand, the public interest in the ferry service. He suggests that the company is much too focused on the FRR and not focused enough on the public interest. This creates a false binary. The public interest is furthered by securing and building up the FRR. The company is a private company, which was the vehicle chosen by Parliament to further the statutory ends. It will only survive while it is profitable. A legislative framework for the inquiry. So I don't propose to read out all of that legislative text. Section 4 provides for the creation of the motor road. Section 79 of the 1923 Act, the path charged for ferry tolls. Sorry, I've also said Section 78 provides for the charging of motor road tolls. And just to point out at this juncture, the company may demand and take for the use of the motor road. So motor road, I've taken you in response to the application to the definition of that, and use, a broad word is used there, as Mr. Dubin says, and which I agree. As such, Section 78 and 79 allow for provisions to be made in the schedule setting out the maximum tolls, i.e. tolls not exceeding is the language, that the ferry company may charge for the use of the road and the ferry. It is these maximum tolls that the Secretary of State may revise by statutory instrument, i.e. these are within the meaning of the 1954 Act, charges which the undertakers are for the time being authorised to demand and take in pursuance of any statutory provision. Section 6 of the 1954 Act applies to the ferry company being a ferry undertaking. And Section 6(2) is key. 2(b), an application may be made to the Minister at any time by the undertakers or by any person appearing to the Minister to have a substantial interest for the revision of the charges which the undertakers are for the time being authorised to demand and take in pursuance of any statutory provision. It follows from this that the Minister and so the Inspector has broad powers to revise the maximum tolls, i.e. the tolls not exceeding the level stated. He may do so in such manner as he may think fit and revise those maximum charges, whether or not they are the subject matter of the application. The company has advanced its non-revised proposal as a package which it considers meets the statutory test and secures the ferry service's future. However, in an effort to assist the inquiry with the legislative meaning, it does follow from statutory language that the Inspector could, for example, agree to one part of the application but not another, or could agree, say, most of the tolls but not the tolls for one particular class, for which he could set a higher or lower maximum toll. The central provision is Section 6(3) of the 1954 Act, which provides materially that when considering whether it is proper to revise the maximum tolls, in making any order on an application under this section, the Minister shall have regard to, and then you can see set out there, sir, the legislative language. This requires some analysis. First, the focus of the inquiry is on the company's financial position and future prospects. That is not to say that other things are necessarily irrelevant, such as environmental objectives, but they are not the central mandatory considerations. The central mandatory considerations are the financial position and future prospects of the undertaking, and that is where the focus must be. And that, sir, is why the company has been so focused on those matters throughout. It is not because the company fails to recognise the public interest, but rather it is in response to the statutory language and test. Second, the test requires that the inspector to consider whether the tolls would be likely to result in an annual revenue either substantially more or substantially less than adequate, and should not revise tolls were to do so would result in that two-part test, likely, and substantially more or less than adequate is met. It must be likely, not merely possible. The word likely is to be given its ordinary meaning, which is from the OED, probably in all probability. As such, the minister should not be focused, sorry, that's the wrong way around. As such, the minister should be focused upon probable and not simply possible outcomes across through the not. The submissions of the consortium at paragraph 7, page 8 of its opening submission are wrong. There, the consortium says, if there remains any doubt in the inspector's mind that a fare increase is necessary or proportionate, there should be no increase, or none that allows any significant return on investment. That is not the legislative test, and the words used there do not describe the legislative test. The question is whether or not the revenue that would be produced is likely to result in substantially more or less than required. Second, the repeated word substantially indicates that there is a considerable margin within which the likely revenue may permissibly fall. Third, it is clear from the statutory language that the focus is on the present financial position and future prospects of the company. This focus follows from the fact that Parliament will have wanted the Minister to reassure himself as to the ability of the company to continue providing the important infrastructure. This point is addressed further in the submissions below. Fourth, as well as immediate expenditure, the Minister is also to consider the need for reasonable contribution to any reserve contingency or other fund. The FRR is plainly not a contingency fund, i.e. for unexpected but possible likely expenses or outages, since the FRR will certainly be needed, yet the Act anticipates that there should be consideration given to the need for reasonable contributions into a contingency fund. No doubt mindful that the nature of the regulated undertakings is such that unexpected but potentially large expenses are not unlikely. Section 27 of the 1956 Act further provides that there is a statutory disregard regarding any loans or financial assistance given by the company to other companies. And then, I set out that section, which is quite lengthy, and with very little punctuation, so I won't read it out. It follows that the ferry company is to be considered on its own terms. The company is an individual legal entity with individual legal personality. It is to be dealt with as such, and so the inquiry should be focused on ensuring that the company is capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Section 4 of the 1986 Act overrode Section 55 of the 1923 Act for providing that the motor road shall continue to be vested in the company rather than becoming a public highway. And I said the rest of it there. Section 11 of the 1986 Act imposes limits on the company's borrowing to 5 million, which includes the share capital. In practical terms, i.e. once share capital has been deducted, this means that capital borrowing is the amount set out there. Matters which are not within the scope of the inquiry, the ferry company agrees with the consortium that the scope of this inquiry is closely defined, and so there are many matters which have been raised by objectors but which fall outside the inquiry's scope. These include the statutory borrowing limit. This is laid down not in the SI but in the Act of Parliament. The Minister has no power to vary this. Such power can only be varied by Parliament, passing a further Act of Parliament. This inquiry is in relation to the question of whether to revise the maximum tolls. It has no jurisdiction to change or make recommendations to change Acts of Parliament. That is the role of Parliament. The FRR. The consortium agrees that the FRR cannot be placed into an escrow account or other account designated for special purpose so as to prevent the ferry company from having access to it save on fulfilment of certain conditions. At the previous inquiry, the ferry company set out a legal note on this point, which was not disputed by the consortium, whose legal representation remains the same. A slightly updated version of this note is appended to these submissions, as Appendix B. The updates are solely to remove previous bundle references and to slightly streamline, but not materially change the analysis. The previous inspector's analysis of this is at the reference given. Periodic review is being suggested by certain objectors that the inspector should either order, request, or recommend that the ferries be reviewed again at the end of a particular period of time. Sorry, sir, just pausing there. Before I forget to say it, I should have added to be that this inquiry, you, sir, the inspector, and the minister have no powers, as I think was conceded by Mr. Dubin, to order the company to place the FRR into any particular account. And there's been no sufficient evidence given as to the availability of other accounts. It simply would not be proper for the inspector or for the minister to make such financial recommendations or so on and so forth. The ferry company has engaged professional advisors in relation to matters of finance, or one of them gave evidence, and there's no good reason to go behind that. Periodic review. It's been suggested by certain objectors that the inspector should either order, request, or recommended that the fares be reviewed again at the end of a particular period of time. However, the powers to trigger a review of the fares is set out in Section 6.2 of the 1954 Act. That alone is a statutory mechanism for reviewing the fares. It should be noted that such an application may be made by any person or body representative of persons appearing to the minister to have a substantial interest. Further, the company submits that neither this inquiry nor the Secretary of State exercising his powers under the 54 Act have powers to require the ferry company or anyone else to go beyond the statutory, to provide documentation that goes beyond the statutory requirement pursuant to Section 35 of the 1923 Act, which requires that the annual accounts of the company be provided to the Secretary of State. These are not only provided to the Secretary of State, but also made publicly available. They set out, in particular, revenue, expenditure, profit, and where the FRR is in that year, and where it should be to be on target, and any surplus or shortfall. This is sufficient. Producing more elaborate accounts and financial analysis would be costly, which cost would be a further drain on revenue and is unnecessary. The information provided is sufficient. It is submitted to allow those with substantial interests to decide upon whether or not to make an application. Moreover, as I said, neither the Secretary of State nor the Inspector has a statutory power to require more. The evidence and analysis. The contrast, first of all, the starting position must be the contrast between the projections before the 2021 inquiry and what has occurred. And just pausing here, I note that what Mr. Dubin recommends to this inquiry is exactly that which was the outcome of the 2021 inquiry when it comes to the powers to raise tolls. But Mr. Dubin does not acknowledge that events that have passed since the 2021 inquiry, the financial circumstances that have materially changed as set out in these tables. It cannot still be logical to stick to the same position, we say, in light of these stark differences. Mr. Thomas, chartered accountant and tax surveyor called by the ferry company, confirmed the following differences between the projections upon which the 2021 toll order was made and that which has occurred in the financial years 2021 to 24, and they're set out there, and in particular the total difference in overall profit of just under 2.4 million. Mr. Thomas also confirmed that the projections before the previous inspector was such that she anticipated the FRR would have sufficient funds in it by the end of the last financial year to be in a position to afford the ferry. In fact, there was a shortfall of 3.9 million, which is not in dispute. Moreover, whereas the projections before the previous inspector were such that she anticipated that dividends would be paid in years ending 22, that should be 23 and 24, forgive me. It should be 22, 23 and 24. Totaling 1.57 million. In fact, no dividends have been capable of being paid since 2018. This follows from the fact that the FRR is not in surplus. This is because, as was the position before the previous inspector, in addition to its accounting policies, which require the same, the company maintains its undertaking to the Secretary of State for Transport that it will not pay any dividends to the shareholders unless the FRR is in the position it needs to be in that year. It has stood by this since 2018 and will do so into the future under this application. So Mr. Dubin said words to the effect that this is merely something which the company has chosen to do, a guarantee it's chosen to do. To be clear, there is an undertaking that has been publicly given to the Secretary of State, which the previous inspector considered to be noteworthy and which she considered to be the maximum that the company can reasonably be expected to do in light of various legal constraints upon it. And whereas Mr. Dubin remarked in a separate context, a publicly made undertaking to the Secretary of State for Transport is a serious matter, and it will, in almost every conceivable circumstance, bind the company. These figures were not disputed during the evidence. The figures follow from a comparison of the figures that the references given. The company relies upon this comparison for two reasons. First, to seek to answer the question as to why it is making an application now when the previous application was successful. The answer is that in just the 4 years since the previous inquiry, an ever-increasing gap has emerged between the revenue received and that which is necessary to meet the expenditure and FRR, let alone any reasonable contingency or return on investment. If action is not taken promptly, the situation is likely to only get worse, with even harder solutions. Second, the company relies upon the large gap between projections and reality as being demonstrative of the need to avoid optimism in projections. The previous inquiry happened almost 1 year into the COVID pandemic, so that was not a surprise. Nevertheless, the projections proved to be unrealistically high. The difficulty with any optimism in forecasting is that it leaves very little room for manoeuvre should it not come to be. It allows an economic problem to grow, which can only belatedly be dealt with by a subsequent application. However, by the time of such application, the worsening economic problem and limited time to resolve it will mean that the tolls will need to increase at a greater gradient than would have been necessary had a more prudent projection been made in the first place. Statement of common ground. A number of important matters have been agreed or agreed not to be an issue between the ferry consortium, sorry, the ferry company and the consortium. This is at 447 and is not repeated, save to point out the following matters have been agreed to not be an issue. So, the date of the replacement, the cost, the measure of a reasonable return on investment, how that is calculated is not an issue between the consortium and the company. The question of how one addresses the question of what a reasonable return is, how that question is informed, and then the rights of the derivatives Mr. Dubin has indicated. The need for the new ferry. The company's position, which it does not understand to be in dispute, I should say, is that the ferry needs to be ordered in 2032 to be replaced in 2034. While several objectors have said that represents a shifting of goals, such criticism is wrong. The position in this regard is exactly as it was before the previous inspector in the 2021 inquiry, who accepted the evidence. In particular, that inquiry noted that the 2032 order for 2034 delivery date was reached following the analysis of naval architect and the fact that while the ferry was undergoing drive shaft repairs in 2019, it was advised that further maintenance and renewal work be undertaken would, in the opinion of the naval architect, work that was undertaken, renewal work that was undertaken, would, in the opinion of the naval architect, extend the ferry's economic life through to 2034. While various lay objectors expressed opinions and doubts about the same, it is apparent that none were drawing on relevant expertise, but were relying on their personal opinions alone. At the previous inquiry, the inspector heard and accepted the evidence of Mr. Hope as to the costs of the new ferry. Mr. Hope had set out the costings for both a diesel hydraulic powered craft and a diesel electric variant. That written evidence has been considered by this inquiry. His main report is at the reference given with costings there in 2019 prices. At reference, Mr. Hope details the benefits of diesel electric over diesel hydraulic, which include future-proofing for fully electric, low-emission options, i.e. use of battery technology, as well as it being quick and clean to change between engines. So I now have a new section, or a new couple of paragraphs. So there is simply no evidence before this inquiry that either there exists or is likely to exist an alternative funding mechanism, that any company offers suitable leasing options. The point is, even factually, at best, highly speculative. The company is unaware of any such leasing companies. The company has relied upon experts in the industry in advising it. Reference 4277. Mr. Hope is an expert naval architect. His report is available to the inquiry. As he makes clear in his report, the company he works for is called Burnett, Corlett and Partners. He states in his report that the company have acted as maritime consultants to the ferry company and have previously been requested to provide advice and estimates. He sets out at some length the various options for the company. It is clear from this that a bespoke asset is called for and that there are a few manufacturers equipped to provide the same. Mr. Keane was asked about whether he has continued to seek advice from the same company as to the ferry company's options when it comes to replacing the ferry. He confirmed that this was the case. The ferry company's position is that it is unaware of any leasing company dealing in chain ferries. That is the matter that is a number of factual points in relation to that matter. However, there are perhaps even more significant legal ones in relation to the same matter. Under a leasing contract, the ferry company would be agreeing to pay the leasing company. Let me start again. Under a leasing contract, the leasing company would theoretically buy the bespoke ferry, but then, pursuant to that leasing contract, the ferry company would have agreed to pay the full value of the ferry plus the leasing company's charges, which will include interest. That agreement to repay the full amount plus charges amounts to a debt for the total value of the leasing contract across its lifetime, which would be not only the ferry cost, but also the leasing company's additional cost. It would be contrary to Section 11 of the 1986 Act, as it would amount to borrowing on the undertaking very much more than £5 million, given that we know it would at least be the value of the ferry, let alone the additional leasing charges. The fact that the payments would be in stages is neither here nor there. That is true of most loans. What is material is the total loan amount, which, as I've said, would be the value of that leasing contract, the obligations the ferry company has under the leasing contract. In his evidence to the inquiry, Mr. King confirmed that the company had agreed to continue to engage Mr. Hope in relation to advice on suitable replacement craft, and the broad position as set out in Mr. Hope's report remains save that the prices have increased with inflation. Mr. King stated that the ferry company considered it sensible to now prefer diesel electric over a diesel hydraulic because of the environmental benefits and the future proofing that would thereby result, particularly if there was regulatory changes. As such, while there may be an upfront cost, it is sensible to incur in circumstances where it is capable of being converted to an all-electric engine in the future should the technology become improving, rather than finding at such juncture that a still otherwise seaworthy vessel needs to be replaced or otherwise undergo extensive conversion if possible. Mr. Clark stated that Dorset Council is seeking to reduce carbon emissions. It would seek to see a propulsion system that is in keeping with that strategy. Mr. King also confirmed that the ferry company elects to keep the current ferry in class with Lloyd's Register. That imposes upon it independent scrutiny and safeguards to which the company would otherwise not be subject. This includes detailed requirements as to maintenance and inspection that provides third-party assessments that are put there. While some objectors have asserted that the ferry service outages in the past are attributable to inadequate stewardship of the ferry, these assertions have been unevidenced and are contrary to the evidence provided by the company, which has not been challenged in this regard. As set out above, the statutory limit on borrowing is £5 million. In any event, Mr. Thomas gave clear evidence that in his experience, he would not expect that any bank would be likely, that should say, unlikely, to lend substantial sums to a company that had not been capable of generating significant profits with operational surpluses, given concerns about the servicing of such debts, the ability to service such debts. Mr. Green agreed with that position, saying that it also follows from his business experience that a bank would be looking at the company's recent financial history and would want to be satisfied that loan repayments would be met. And I provided an additional reference to some of the written evidence. While £5 million may be the statutory limit, it does not follow that amount will be made available to the ferry company if its financial position does not improve, i.e. if the 2021 order remains in place. It should be noted that while Chris Nicholson provided the inspector with some general information about his knowledge of the position in relation to general project finance loan issues, it was apparent that while his knowledge did extend to some regulated industries such as water, but in what precise capacity in relation to each company and each credit arrangement, it was not clear, that should say, within the parentheses, it was not clear. He was able to speak in general terms only. It is clear that the legislative framework, powers and restrictions that pertain to the ferry company are unique. Its most expensive asset, the ferry, is a bespoke asset upon which virtually all of the company's income depends, and that asset is a mechanically complex machine which is liable to the risk of outages, 2 of which have occurred in the past 6 years. When such outages occur, virtually all of the company's income stops and its expenditure increases. It is difficult to think of many companies subject to such considerable risk, e.g. a water company will serve a broad area and will tend to have many localised outages, and the aviation company will tend to own many interchangeable aeroplanes. Real caution should be taken in relation to Mr Nicholson's generalised remarks. Mr Keane alone has experience of dealing with banks and lenders in relation to the ferry company over his time as chairman, and he gave clear evidence on this point. His evidence should be preferred over others' views of the position that may or may not pertain in the world of project finance more generally. Income, revenue and traffic projections. The core focus of the inquiry has been on traffic projections. It is of course the case that the financial projections depend upon certain informed assumptions about future traffic volumes. The inspector does not have to form a definitive view as to what precisely will happen, but rather he needs to ask whether the projections advanced and evidence relied upon cause him to conclude that it is likely that the total salt would result in substantially more, substantially less than adequate to meet expenditure contingency, the FR, and return on investment. In summary on this issue, the ferry company submits that the most relevant data is actual traffic data of the use of the ferry, and that particular attention should be paid to the years following the COVID-19 pandemic in 2021, given that there was a significant drop in passenger numbers in that year, and that while there was a partial rebound in 21-22, this was still significantly less than in 17-18, the last normal year. 2024 numbers were very slightly lower than 2023, and evidence was given that 2025 numbers are on course to be slightly lower still. None of this makes an increase in traffic volumes likely in the future. This evidence is suggestive either of a slight decline or a flatlining in passenger volume levels. The company reiterates, as is such an important point, that rationally the table of actual passenger volumes at reference must be at the centre of any analysis of likely future passenger volumes, and particular attention paid to post-COVID years. The external sources of information that have been relied upon by various witnesses, including the consortium, Dr. Langley, are of no real assistance to the analysis, as they're simply too general and or unrelated to ferry use. The ferry company has produced two projections where all elements of the same for the traffic projections. The first projection, described as the primary projection in opening, was explained by Mr. Thomas. In short, Mr. Thomas took the actual traffic volumes that used the ferry in the year ending 24. He then applied a one-time deduction to reflect the historic decline over time that has been observed. Thereafter, he held levels steady, i.e. applied no further deduction or increase across the projected period. It will be recalled that Mr. Thomas gave evidence that FYE 2019 was unusually low. The traffic volumes were unusually low because of the drive chain failure, and so you're very familiar with the remainder of that paragraph, so I'll just leave it there for your reference. Paragraph 49, Mr. Thomas explained his reasoning for the primary projection, which was threefold. Analysis of the Class F cars from 1998 to 2018 showed a trending decrease in Class F volumes over time. He demonstrated this by reference to linear extrapolation, which set out. The consortium agreed that, as a matter of fact, that data did disclose a trend of on average, 0.3% decline in Class F from 2000 to 2018. Mr. Thomas's logic was that given there has been a consistent decline in Class F volumes, it would be prudent to assume there would be some decline into the future. Analysis of the actual traffic volumes indicate that post-COVID traffic volumes are consistently and significantly lower than the pre-COVID norm. He referred to that table, which I've already referred to. These shows that FYE 2018 volumes were 724,000, which was typical of that period. By contrast, year ending 22 volumes were 647,000, and in 2024 they were 634,504. Mr. Thomas gave evidence that For the year ending 2025, which is ongoing, the Class F volumes were 1% lower than for FYE 2024, even excluding December 2024 when the mini refit occurred. There is a need for financial prudence in projection. Financially prudent projections may tend to provide some economic headroom to allow for unpredictable but not unlikely contingencies. Mr. Thomas referred to the 2019-20 outage caused by the drive shaft failure and the 2023 collision, which led to both significant unexpected expenditure and loss of income. Mr. Thomas confirmed he had not made separate provision in the company's forecast for payments into any contingency fund, and as such, his careful rather than optimistic projections were designed to allow some economic headroom for contingencies. Mr. Thomas gave evidence to the effect that his approach was normal, prudent accounting approach. Mr. Thomas is a chartered accountant, and there is no reason to doubt this. It was not adequately put to him that the accounting forecast should have set out contingencies as a separate item, as is now suggested by the consortium. But in any event, such matters of accounting practice and presentation are simply not within the scope of this inquiry. Should overly optimistic projections fail to be realised, then the ferry service will be left with an economic shortfall, which will only increase over time. I've already made this point, sir, forgive me, you've got that point. The ferry company submits that these projections are financially sensible. They're grounded in the most relevant data, which is actual traffic volumes over time and by comparison since COVID. They are not optimistic, but neither are they pessimistic. Instead, they are prudent, given they seek to take account of the need for some economic headroom, which has proved to be so necessary in the past. Mr. Thomas's primary projections with the increased discounts are set out at 329, showing the projections under the 2021 order. And so I then list how the FRR will show a shortfall in the important years. In oral evidence, Mr. Thomas confirmed that even that assumes there is no unexpected expense or outage, should any such event occur, which clearly is not unlikely, then the shortfall would be even greater. As well as the shortfall in the FRR, it would also be impossible for there to be any dividends paid throughout the entire period to 2040 and beyond. In short, the ferry company would cease to be viable, unable to replace the ferry, and not functioning as a profitable company. The position under the application as revised with the primary projection is set out at 330. This shows that there will be a surplus of 1 million by 2034, thereby building in some contingency for unexpected expenses. It would not be possible to pay dividends until 2033 at the earliest, but even that, assuming there is no unexpected expense, since it would be dividends that bear the risk first, giving prioritisation to the FRR. This would mean that the average return on investment in the period 2025 to 40 would be 0.5% based on dividends expressed as a percentage of net asset value. Even that average takes no account of the 7 years prior to 2025 with no dividends paid at all, i.e. since 2018. In light of the objectors describing Mr. Thomas's projections as pessimistic in their written responses, which is coming in refutes for the above reasons, Mr. Thomas also provided secondary projections along with his rebuttal statement. These are described and exhibited. The projections are based upon an average of 2018 and 2018. What this means in practice is that the projections suppose a one-time 7.06% increase in Class F from 2024 levels from 2025 onwards, which, to be clear, is one time but then held at that increased level, as explained in paragraph 9 of the rebuttal statement. So it's a one-time increase of 7.06%, an immediate increase from 2025 onwards, but then held at that level. So each year is an increase on 2024, but there's no increase year on year within that. Mr. Thomas made clear in his oral evidence that such a positive outcome for traffic volumes is not likely and is not supported by any of the evidence relating to recent or more historic traffic volumes. It is undoubtedly an extremely optimistic projection, which he says is unrealistically optimistic projection. Notably, it is higher than any of the other projections suggested by the consortium or Dr. Langley. Mr. Thomas's secondary projection shows that even under the highly optimistic projections of traffic volume, if the 2021 order remained in place, then there would still be a shortfall in the FRR in 2032 when the new ferry must be purchased, when the order actually it must be put in, and the ferry company needs to know it's in a financial position to place that order. The shortfall will persist in 2033. By 2034, there will be a surplus of just over 1.1 million, but this is only assuming that there is no unexpected expense or outage over the next 10 years. It would not be possible to pay any dividend through to beyond 2040. Moreover, a growing deficit will be projected in 2039 and 2040. As such, and even aside from the point that the ferry company must have sufficient funds in 2032, the 2021 order would only be sufficient to purchase the new ferry if all of the following occurred. First, an immediate increase in Class F volumes by 7.06% from the 1st of April 2024 onwards, which date has already passed, that being the beginning of the 2025 financial year. Second, such increase be sustained across the following 10 years so that the volumes do not decline below that level. And third, that no outage or other cause of significant expense or loss of income occur across the next 10 years, despite two such incidents having occurred in the past 6 years. Fourth, a financial lender could be found who was willing in 2032 to lend the ferry company up to the maximum statutory limit, notwithstanding the fact that even if such projections came to pass, the ferry company's finances would have been so tight that it would have been running at a deficit until that year and would be projected to do so until 2034. The inspector and minister is to ask himself what is likely by reference back to the statutory test. The above scenario is inherently unlikely to occur. The projected increase in traffic volumes is steep and sudden and flies in the face of the actual traffic volumes, which show the 2024 Class A volumes were slightly lower than 2022 and 2025. This is not supportive of any increase from 2024 volumes, let alone a steep increase, which is thereafter maintained. The secondary projection is also not likely to occur because, I think I've already made the point about the outage, and you've got Inspector Weiss's point there. Notwithstanding the unlikelihood of all of the secondary projection, it can be seen that even if it were to occur, it would not result in revenue being substantially more than adequate to meet expenditure, FRR, contingency, and a reasonable return on investment. So that should mean to indicate, even if it were coupled, that projection were coupled with the application being approved. That's the key point of paragraph 58. So even if that unlikely projection were coupled with the application being approved, that's why I do say that in the paragraph. It can be seen that even under this projection, the FRR remains in deficit until 2030. In 2032, when the order must be placed, there's a surplus of 1.3 million, and in 2034, there's a surplus of 2.3 million. A surplus of such level would only exist if no unexpected outages or other large expense or loss of income occurred, which is unlikely. Moreover, such a surplus would be entirely appropriate to provide for such contingencies as envisaged by the Act. Mr. Thomas's oral evidence was that even after insurance, the outages of 2019 and 2023 were in the order of £1 million, and that in terms of the costs incurred by the company, and that one has to prepare for the possibility of more than one such outage across a 10-year period. He went on to say the one would wish to have a surplus in the region of 15 to 20% of the amount required in 2034. He said that given the amount required will be circa 17 million, the surplus should be in the region of 3 million. Hence, the projected surplus, even in 2034, would be less than the amount that Mr. Thomas said would be advisable by way of buffer or contingency. That's even if you have the increase in traffic volume and this application. In addition, even in this highly optimistic scenario, no dividends would be capable of being paid before 2031, which would mean 12 years of zero return on investment. The average return on investment across the projected period, 2025 to 2040, would be 1.6%. This contrasts with what Inspector Weiss considered to be a reasonable average return on investment of around 3.46%. The reason for all of this analysis for the secondary projection is that it allows the inspector and minister to conclude that even in the highly unlikely and optimistic scenario, where there was in the current financial year a 7.06% increase in Class F volumes from the 2024 volumes, which increase was then maintained through to 2034, even if the application were approved, that combination of events would not result in the company receiving substantially more than adequate to meet the various statutory matters, the statutory considerations, that should say. This is quite aside from the fact that the outcome is far from likely, which is what the minister is to consider, i.e. even leaving its inherent unlikelihood if the situation did arise. Even leaving aside, its inherent unlikelihood, even if this situation did arise, it would not result in the company receiving substantially more than adequate to meet its needs. The consortium sensitivity analysis and income projections. The consortium have produced what they call a sensitivity analysis. It's described at those sections. In answer to cross-examination, Mr. Clark confirmed that the various scenarios were intended to illustrate the range of possible outcomes in the view of the consortium, both under the 2021 order and the application. Mr. Clark confirmed that the cumulative income in the consortium's calculations did not take into account major and minor refit years, which occur in alteration every 2 years, despite the fact that each causes a loss of income. In this proof of evidence that was available to the consortium before they entered their proof of evidence, Mr. Thomas had noted the major refits caused 6 weeks' income to be lost. Minor, 2 weeks' income will be lost. In his oral evidence, Mr. King confirmed those were minimum time periods necessary, and they would often take longer. As such, these income levels are overstated when compared to the profit and loss income projections, as Mr. Clark confirmed. Mr. Clark also confirmed that the sensitivity analysis took no account of and made no projections in relation to expenditure, payments into the FRR, any contingency, or return on investment under any of the scenarios. As such, the consortium's calculations simply do not assist this inquiry with the application of the statutory test, which requires consideration of all these things. In answer to questioning, Mr. Clark confirmed that he was unable to say that a new ferry would be capable of being purchased in 2032 or 2034 under any of its scenarios 1 to 3 involving the 2021 order with its 3% per annum increase. He was specifically asked about scenario 2, which was the highest of the 3 2021 scenarios involving, as it did, the assumption of 0.5% increase in Class F volume from 2025 onwards. He confirmed that he could not say whether that would produce sufficient income to purchase a new ferry. Mr. Thomas's oral evidence, upon which he was not challenged by the consortium or any other objector in this regard, was that under scenario 2 there would be a shortfall in the FRR as of 2032 and 2034. Mr. Clark was also asked about scenario 5, which was premised upon the application being permitted and there being a 0.5% annual increase in Class F volumes from 2025 onwards. He stated that while he could say that this would be sufficient to cover projected expenditure, it was not possible to say anything more about this. In particular, it was not possible to say what surplus, if any, there would be for contingencies and whether any, when I refer to projected expenditure, I should have been clear, including the purchase of a new ferry. Was not possible to say what surplus, if any, there would be for contingencies and whether any dividends could be paid to deliver return on investment. It is unclear whether the consortium, in setting out various traffic scenarios, sought to imply that if traffic volumes were to increase and the application be approved, then the revenue would be more than adequate, or even substantially more than adequate, to meet expenditure contingency and a reasonable return on investment. However, if the consortium didn't intend to imply that through their sensitivity analysis, then such conclusion simply does not follow from that analysis. The consortium scenarios tell us nothing about anything other than income. It does not consider the same against the various items such as expenditure set out in the 56th Act. In any event, Mr. Clark confirmed the following: that the actual traffic volumes showed between 2000 and 2018 showed an average 0.3% decline. That contrary to the gradual rebound considered in the consortium's proof of evidence, the actual traffic volumes does not demonstrate ongoing growth beyond 2022. I said, it must be correct. The data he relied upon shows a gradual trending increase in traffic volumes on the A351 at Stowborough from 1995 onwards. However, the Class F volumes on the ferry showed a trending average 0.3 decline per annum across the same period. As such, it was not possible to infer from the increasing number of cars on the A351 there would be likely to be any increase in ferry passenger numbers. In his evidence, Mr. Keane confirmed that many such drivers passing through Stowborough would not have a quicker journey, given that Stowborough is a considerable distance from the ferry terminal. Mr. Clark was unable to give any detail about that up to 5.95% increase in car driver trips in Purbeck. He was unable to say how the figure had been arrived at, other than he understood that it had come from software Tempro, which he said is used by the Department for Transport, but which he personally did not use. He was not able to say whether that growth was predicted to be concentrated in certain parts of Purbeck or spread across the peninsula. Mr. Clark confirmed that the consortium had used the 5.95% figure on the Isle of Purbeck to generate the 0.5% annual growth in Class F volumes in scenarios 2 and 4. Mr. Clark confirmed this meant that the consortium had assumed in those two scenarios that there would be like-for-like increases between, on the one hand, predicted car journeys on Purbeck, and on the other, Class F journeys on the ferry, i.e. that all of the increase in the relevant area would convert into journeys on the ferry. He confirmed it was not possible to say that such outcome was likely. Mr. Clark referred to the Strava app, which recorded not car journeys but personal exercise, such as cycling and walks/runs. He said that there had been a 36% increase in activity on Ferry Road from 2019 to 2023. He accepted that this was an opt-in record with users choosing to share data publicly, and also confirmed that there had been an increase in awareness of the app across a relevant period. He said that the area on Ferry Road was amongst the top 1% of roads recorded on Strava as being for personal physical activity. To be clear, the ferry company accepts that the nearby beaches are popular for walks and other physical activity. However, that does not and has not converted to increases in Class F volumes. The Strava data tells us nothing about that. For all of these reasons, the consortium traffic evidence and sensitivity analysis is of very little assistance with this inquiry. However, what it does demonstrate is that even the consortium transports team most optimistic projection was limited to a 0.5% per annum increase in Class F volumes from 2024. That was not presented as a likelihood, but merely as the most optimistic out of the range of possible scenarios. That puts any other projections of increases from Class F in the appropriate context. Finally, but most importantly, the unchallenged evidence of Mr. Thomas was that scenario 2, which was the 0.5% increase with the 2021 order in place, would still result in there being insufficient funds in the FRR to purchase a new ferry in 2034. As such, even under the consortium's most optimistic traffic projections, the 2021 tolls would be insufficient to purchase the new ferry. In short, nothing in the consortium's evidence even suggests that the revenue under the application would be more than adequate. Still less is it likely to be substantially more. Moreover, the combination of the consortium's analysis of the most optimistic scenario shows that unless 2021 order tolls are revised, there would not be sufficient funds to purchase the new ferry. Purchasing the new ferry is not the only financial imperative facing the company, which is also to survive as a viable private company, must also make a profit beyond that. But replacing the ferry is its first order primary imperative. Without it, the ferry service will not survive. As such, even under the most optimistic scenario advanced by the consortium, the ferry service will not survive beyond 2034 unless the 2021 tolls, with their 3% per annum increase, are increased. In his submissions, Dr. Langley argued that the company's traffic volume projections were very pessimistic. As said above, the ferry company says they're not pessimistic but financially prudent in light of the traffic volume trends and need for contingency. Dr. Langley proposed his own comparative model to seek to show that, in his opinion, a new ferry could be afforded with the 2021 order in place. However, Dr. Langley's model is premised upon there being significant traffic volume increases from the 2024 levels of around 1% per annum, i.e. year-on-year growth, so that within 10 years the traffic volumes would be as high as the pre-COVID 2018 levels. Thereafter, his model assumes yet further annual increases. The word increases is missing. Dr. Langley confirms that the rate of increase in traffic volumes that he was assuming of around 1% was double the highest scenario suggested by the consortium, which was 0.5% per annum. Dr. Langley was asked in cross-examination what positive evidence he relied upon to indicate that there would be any increase in traffic volumes from 2024. He referred back to the pre-COVID traffic volumes and said that, in his opinion, that reduction in traffic volumes since COVID was transient and would rebound. When asked in cross-examination whether the post-COVID ferry traffic volumes provided any positive evidence to support the conclusion that there was a post-COVID ongoing rebound, Dr. Langley pointed out that in FY 2020-2021, during COVID, traffic volumes were very low and then increased. He said that this showed a rebound. However, he accepted that given the 2024 levels were actually slightly lower than the 2022 levels, the most recent traffic volumes did not indicate that any rebound was ongoing. At paragraph 3.4.6, Dr. Langley said it would be helpful to have the traffic data for FYE 2025 so far to indicate the way in which the volume is currently heading. It was put to him that this data was still being generated, but Mr. Thomas's evidence was that it was 1% down in FYE 2024. Dr. Langley said he had not seen this evidence, but that if the evidence was accepted by the inspector, then while he did not accept the evidence as conclusive, he accepted that such data indicates that there could be a flattening of the curve. As such, Dr. Langley's evidence was that he does not consider the similar traffic volumes in 22, 24 and 25 to be conclusive of the matter, but accepts there could be a flattening of the curve, shown by the scale. To seek to support his assumption of gross and class F volumes, Dr. Langley referred to the increase in UK national population. He accepted that he did not know what the population's projections were for the area served by the ferry company. The company submits that national population growth provides no support at all for an assumption of growth in the use of the ferry from 2024 levels. It is simply far too generalised and unrelated to the use of the ferry. Dr. Langley was asked whether there was any positive evidence or data from which he had derived 1% per annum that he had assumed. He confirmed there was not, but referred against the UK population, national population growth. Importantly, Dr. Langley did confirm that if the 2021 order remains in place and traffic volumes do not increase from the 2024 levels, then there would be insufficient money to purchase a new ferry in 2034. This is of central importance. By that response, Dr. Langley conceded that the 2021 order would be inadequate to meet even the company's most basic financial need, i.e. the need to replace its ferry in 2034, unless there's an increase from the status quo, i.e. current traffic volumes. There is simply no good evidence to support such an assumed increase, and there is significant and directly relevant evidence which points against an assumption, namely the recent traffic volumes. This is the most recent evidence and most relevant evidence for predicting future ferry traffic volumes, and rather than indicating an increase, it points either to stasis or a decline. The ferry company agrees with Dr. Langley that if the traffic volumes remain at the 2024 levels, then, if the 2021 order remains in place, the ferry company would lack sufficient funds to purchase a new ferry in 2034. That is even assuming there is no unexpected expense or loss of income, such as due to an outage. Indeed, as noted above, Mr. Thomas gave oral evidence, which is not challenged, that even if the consortium's most optimistic projection of 0.5% growth in Class F came to pass, and the 2021 order remained in place, there would still be inadequate funds to purchase the ferry in 2034. In addition, Dr. Langley confirmed that his analysis of the potential financial outcomes of the application was mainly premised upon the tolls and discounts proposed in the original application rather than the revised application. He confirmed that, for example, the first 4 rows of Table 2 all relate to the original application rather than the revised application. Only the last row of that table relates to the revised application. He refers to that as the revised application as opposed to the proposed tolls, which phrase he uses to refer throughout to the original application. This is important because throughout his evidence, Dr. Langley refers to income and potential surpluses under what he describes as the proposed tolls, by which, in light of his evidence during cross-examination, it is reasonably clear Dr. Langley means the original application. As such, Dr. Langley's analysis of the proposed tolls, for the most part, do not relate to the tolls actually now being proposed by the company. It is important the inspector bears that firmly in mind when considering his analysis. The only place where Dr. Langley projects the profit under the revised proposal is at paragraph 4.4.2, where he states that the revised tolls and traffic would generate 11.9 million pre-tax profit and interest, which he says would meet the company's requirements of about 10.8 million. It's submitted that such a relatively tight margin between the amount required to buy the new ferry and the projection is very far from being more than adequate, given the 10-year projection period, the need for contingency, and the fact that the requirement of 10.8 million is what would be required simply for the company to buy a new ferry before one even considers the question of return on investment. As such, Dr. Langley's evidence was in totality, considered in totality, does not provide any sufficient basis for concluding that under this application, the revenue would be likely more than, still less substantially more than adequate to meet expenditure, contingency and return on investment. As set out above, the company has statutory power, so I'll just take a sip of water. The company has the statutory power to charge a toll for use of the motor road, and it did so until 7th of August 1991. It proposes to reintroduce the road toll. Full reasons for this are set out at the reference. One of the most important reasons for reintroducing that is to seek to increase the profit needed to meet the company's financial requirements without relying solely on the ferry users. The ferry company has explained that it expects to generate about 50,000 per annum, but importantly this will come with only minimal costs to the ferry company. These costs to the company are based upon discussions with appropriate enforcement companies who will bear the set-up costs subject to a 7.5% share of the revenue based upon a sufficiently long contracts, and with the enforcement company being entitled to any penalty income payable. As such, the toll would generate a high amount of profit relative to that revenue. While certain objectors have suggested that the amount generated would be trivial against the overall finances, it can be appreciated that across 10 years a figure in the order of £50,000 profit per year is far from trivial. Mr. Keane explained the basis for the company's estimate of the road toll revenue. He explained they were projected based upon the company's knowledge of current usage of the ferry road, but then making appropriate deductions to reflect the fact that when a charge was levied, the number of cars along the road would be likely to reduce, and to reflect the various users who would not be charged the road toll, most notably those who have already paid to use the ferry that day. Mr. Keane then explained how the reasonableness of those estimates was tested by conducting daily spot counts of cars parked along the road. The ferry then considered that around 30% of those currently parked would be likely to be representative of the number of cars who would pay the toll. This is based on several factors set out in the reference given, but principally in the fact that the experience of the company is that the majority of cars parked on the road will have come across on the ferry and so will not pay the charge. In addition is the fact that those parking for shorter periods will probably choose to park in the National Trust car parks as being somewhat cheaper for under 2 hours. Additionally, deductions ought to be made given its proposed of the exemptions for those two postcodes within the 5-mile radius. It is submitted while necessarily these are approximations, an assumption that about 30% of the spot checks total would in fact pay the road toll is reasonable, given the justification set out for it. It can be seen from comparison of the spot checks and projections that while in some months the spot check is a little higher, in other months it's a little lower than the projections, it's broadly similar. It's submitted that this indicates that the road toll estimates, while not in exact science, are reasonable. It is notable, at least insofar as I said in my notes and memory indicates, that no objector cross-examined Mr. Keane on these estimates. The company said it would be incumbent to do so if any serious objection was taken to the estimates. In relation to the level of the toll, Mr. Keane gave evidence to the fact that this was set by bearing in mind what other nearby sites charge for parking. Once those rates were considered, it was determined that for ease of charging and practicability, it would make sense to have a flat rate, which would be the same as the ferry toll. The proposed toll was slightly more expensive than those tolls for short periods, but significantly cheaper for periods of over 2 hours. There are various legal points related to the road toll. With respect, the company submits that these are all points which distract from the statutory test, which the Inspector and Secretary of State are concerned. So as to seek to assist the Inspector, these are set out in an appendix. I believe that's appendix. It's appendix A, I think, rather than appendix B, but I'll be correct on that. The company's position is that it's reasonable to charge for the use of the road. The ferry road is part of the company assets and was envisaged by Parliament in 1923 that tolls from it would generate revenues for the company along with tolls for the ferry. As such, Parliament envisaged there being two revenue streams, but both of them feeding into the general revenues of the ferry company rather than being siloed from each other. The company submits the proposed charge as reasonable, particularly in light of the exemptions proposed. In order for the road toll not to impinge too greatly on use of the road by neighbours and those accessing nearby businesses, or for example, for those collecting people from the ferry, it's very sensible to impose the charge on those stationary along the road for more than 30 minutes, not in one of the exempt groups. Similarly, it is fair not to impose the charge on those who've already paid to cross the ferry on the ferry that day. They've already provided a helpful contribution to the company's revenue. Some objectors sought to argue this point from first principle, paying out that would mean certain users of the road pay to use it in certain circumstances, whereas others would not. However, these matters should turn on what's fair and reasonable in all the circumstances, with particular attention to the mandatory questions of the company's financial position and prospects. The proposed exemptions are fair and reasonable. There will inevitably be certain people who wish the exemptions to go a little further or a little less far, to include some people or to exclude others. However, the Inspector will appreciate this is inevitable in the compilation of any such list of exemptions. It will be apparent to the Inspector that these exemptions have been arrived at following the company carefully considering the evidence of objectors and the practical issues and taking those points on board in a way that was intended to be both constructive and fair. Further, as set out above, the company submits that its estimates for the revenue are reasonable estimates. This is, of course, the need to make educated rather than exact estimates, and that's what's been done in a manner that is reasonable and proportionate to the issue. Questions about the company's historic finances and the issue of a reasonable return on investment. A number of objectors have sought to argue that the Inspector should analyse the company's historic finances. Mr. Golub argues that it is necessary for this analysis to extend back to 1994. It is notable that despite advocating this, Mr. Golub did not put any of the documents upon which he apparently relied into evidence. In any event, the company submits that this inquiry cannot realistically be expected to review 31 years of finances. To do so properly, it would be necessary to consider all the relevant documentation and then consider why in any given year particular decisions were made based upon the evidence then available, rather than retrospectively analysing the same with the benefit of 31 years of foresight and knowing what would happen both in respect of the company and the wider economy. Such an inquiry would be hugely lengthy and costly. It would be necessary to examine what was known and considered at any particular point in time, but also to consider what was reasonable for company directors to conclude at that point in time, in light of the information then reasonably available concerning likely expenditure, amongst other things. This inquiry is not required to do that. The inquiry's remit is to consider in particular the financial position and future prospects of the undertaking. The focus is on the present position and the future. Such focus follows from the fact that the inquiry is focused on whether the future revenue is likely to be adequate or not. It is correct that Section 6.3 contains a caveat whereby the inquiry, and so the Minister, may expressly consider the financial position of the undertaking during such period immediately preceding the application, and may, if he considers there are special circumstances, reflect those circumstances in his revision of the charges. The phrase immediately preceding is not defined in the Act. However, it's been given its natural meaning. The financial position immediately preceding the application must be intended to refer to the position up until or just before the application. This application was made in July 2024. Mr. Golub refers back to 1994. Others wish to refer back to the financial positions in the early to mid-2010s. It is not in dispute that no dividend has been paid by the company since 2018. On any view, matters prior to 2018 cannot be considered to be matters immediately preceding this application. And in the event, there must be at least a strong presumption for the inquiry not to go back and re-examine historic matters that have already been considered at length by other inquiries and in respect of which conclusions have already been reached by other inspectors. That is not to say that the inspector in this case is not to form his own view about the matters which he considers to be relevant to the statutory test. Of course, he must do exactly that. However, it's submitted that where reference is made back not to contemporaneous evidence or matters or new points, but only back to historic events and points that have been considered at length by previous inspectors and in respect of which they have heard evidence and reached conclusions, then this inspector should be very slow to consider those historic matters as part of his inquiry in light of both the statutory direction regarding mandatory considerations and the fairness requirement not to hear some incomplete evidence. The purpose of various objectors' references back to historic finances appears to be essentially making assertions that in the view of some people, the directors took too much in the way of dividends in the past, at least with the benefit, they say in their view, with the benefit of hindsight. However, as Mr. Keane indicated in evidence, the dividend payments of the company were in line with what had been projected to be paid before previous inquiries. This is shown through consideration of, for example, Inspector Wild's report dated 21st January 2015. At paragraph 74, he says, "I agree with the company that the enterprise can be considered to be low in risk compared to some other businesses. However, it's certainly not risk-free, and the proposed rate of return of between 6.2 and 6.5% is only slightly above that for low-risk bonds investments. Furthermore, it has been shown that the return will not be out of line with similar industries. In light of these factors, I conclude that the proposed dividends are reasonable. It would therefore be unreasonable to expect the company to reduce the dividends to inject more capital." So while various objectors now, from the vantage point of the evidence in 2024, wish to go back and criticise what was done years ago, it can be seen that as late as 2015, an inspector who heard the evidence considered returns which are far higher than anything proposed in the 2021 inquiry, or this inquiry, would be reasonable at that time. Clearly, that inspector did not consider that the company had been reckless or unwise in its running of the company. Inspector Wild expressly endorsed the proposed dividends and rejected the suggestion that additional capital should be injected in preference to that. Of course, the application to revise tolls was rejected in 2018, in significant part because of the dividend policy in place at that time and lack of prioritisation of the FRR. Since 2018, the company's financial policy has changed fundamentally. The FRR now has return priority above return on investment. No one disputes that this position has been maintained by the company since that date. The FRR is put above return on investment in order of priority, even though that has meant that the investors have not received any payment by way of dividends since 2018 and not projected to receive any more, even should the application succeed, until the 2030s. And should we know that's even if there's an uptick in the traffic volumes. At the last inquiry, the inspector considered all of these points, considering in particular what the inspector before her had noted at the 2018 inquiry and what had occurred since that inquiry. Inspector Weiss was satisfied that this change in financial policy was significant and reassuring, saying that the 2018-19 changes, that is a step change in comparison to previous years. She went on to note that as set out above, measures are now in place to ensure the FRR is prioritised ahead of the payments of any dividends, and content that those arrangements are sufficient to ensure the returns are only paid where appropriate. As such, Inspector Weiss considered the previous inspector's analysis and was satisfied that these changes in place were significant and reassuring. She considered that in light of these matters, which pertain to that which happened between Inspector Stone's inquiry and her inquiry. It would be appropriate for there to be a return on investment if the FRR was in the position it needed to be in a given year. She considers that an average rate of return of 3.46% would be reasonable, noting that it was much lower than that proposed in the 2018 inquiry, and it will be noted is much lower than that approved in the 2009 inquiry. It may be suggested by some objectors that the pre-2018 financial history should justify the company receiving no or an extremely low return on investment. However, the approach of Inspector Weiss is instructive. She considered the relevant evidence, including the conclusions of inspectors going before her. Nothing has happened since Inspector Weiss's report in terms of the management of the company or its dividend policies, which could justify the inspector and minister concluding that despite all that, events that occurred not quite long ago, and which were consistent at least with the views of Inspector White, should justify the ferry company receiving either no or a very low return on investment, even in the medium term, knowing that under this application, the return on investment is likely until the 2030s. It's correct that the 1923 Act stated that by its preamble, there was to be constructed and established a motor road and ferry to provide a more direct means of communication and be of public and local advantage. However, by the 1923 Act, Parliament also decided that rather than the public purse bearing the expense of establishing that and thereafter maintaining and running that at public expense, it should be established, maintained, and run at private expense by a private company. Likewise, Parliament did not choose for this to be done by a charity or a not-for-profit vehicle, but a private company. For private companies to survive, it must make a reasonable return on investment. That is at the centre of it, and under company law, directors hold responsibilities to diligently seek to generate returns. Hence, in passing the 1923 Act, Parliament was well aware that the quid pro quo for the company bearing all of these costs, rather than being borne by local or national taxpayers, is that the company would expect to generate a return on investment. It will be appreciated that a private company which generates no return on its investment cannot survive for very long. Investors in such a position would likely conclude they cannot justify continuing the investment. As such, a reasonable return on investment is necessarily inherent in the ongoing running of the ferry service by a private company. I referred to 1954 and said the words "if appropriate" do not, and is submitted, are not intended to call into question the fact that private companies need to generate a reasonable return on investment to survive. Instead, these words are intended to give priority first to the other mandatory matters to be considered, notably expenditure and a reasonable reserve, the Minister and Inspector should consider the likely revenue by reference to those matters first, and then the return on investment. It is respectfully submitted that Inspector Weiss was correct to conclude, as she did, the principle of the shareholders taking a dividend from the company is clearly appropriate as it is allowed by the statute. It is not appropriate, in my view, however, to take dividends without first ensuring there are sufficient funds in the FRR to ensure that a new ferry can be obtained when required, as has happened in the past. As set out above, measures are now in place to ensure the FRR is prioritised ahead of the payment of dividends. I am content these arrangements are sufficient to ensure that returns are paid only where appropriate. It will be noted that under the company's primary traffic projections for return on investment, if the application is permitted, an extremely low average of just 0.5% for the period 2025 to 2040. Even that average takes into account of the 7 years prior to 2025, no dividends paid at all. Even under the company's, what I say, it's unrealistically optimistic secondary projections, the average would be 1.6%, and that contrasts with what Inspector Weiss considered to be a reasonable average on return. The 1.6% is an unrealistically optimistic outcome. Even then, it can only be seen as a low return on investment. This follows from the company's diligent and continued prioritisation of the FRR since 2019. In these circumstances, there would be no reasonable basis for concluding that setting the tolls in such a manner that no return on investment was appropriate. What the above analysis shows is that with the proposed tolls set out in this application, even if an overly optimistic outcome regarding traffic volumes were to occur, the rates of return would still be low. Hence, there would be no basis for the Inspector or Minister to conclude by reference to the statutory test that the proposed tolls would be likely to result in revenue substantially more than adequate to meet expenditure, contingency, FRR, and a reasonable return on investment. Several objectors have suggested that some measure of return on investment other than dividends expressed as percentage of net asset valuation should be chosen. For example, some said there should be a account taken of capital growth, even though that growth could not be extracted from the company unless it was sold, which assumes a willing buyer with funding. None have proposed any method by which such matters could be taken into account by the Inspector, and it's submitted that such matters are not properly returns on investment, given the particular nature of the company, where shares are not publicly traded, etc. Moreover, any attempt to value the sale would be fraught with difficulties, and whilst various objectors have raised the point of principle, they've not gone beyond that. It's submitted that the Inspector should not depart from the methodology employed by his predecessor inspectors and endorsed by the Minister by approving those recommendations in 2009, 2015, 2018 and 2021, all measured return on investment by reference to an annual dividends expressed as a percentage of net asset value. It is a useful and readily applicable measure of the return on investment, and it properly relates to actual returns received by the investor rather than by reference to some other indirect and disputed measure of gains. The level of tolls. It will be appreciated that when setting the level of tolls, regard needs to be had to the statutory test and the company's financial prospects, since this objective must be, amongst other things, to seek to ensure the survival of the privately run ferry service. As such, the company's financial needs in order to survive need to be considered alongside realistic traffic projections. By its revised application, the company has sought to secure the statutory objectives while, insofar as possible, seeking to minimise the impact on, in particular, regular passengers. It will be noted that the proposed increases are not arbitrary increases, but are inflationary-based increases, reflecting the fact that the tolls currently charged have fallen quite far behind inflation. This application simply seeks to rebase the tolls so they are in line with inflation. It does not go beyond that. I'll just make a point about inflation being cumulative. The company has sought to minimise the impact of bringing tolls in line with inflation by including significant discounts for bulk ticket purchases. Indeed, these bulk ticket discounts will actually increase from the current levels for around 2 or 3 years, before then settling at the lower rates of 24% and 28%. These are still much higher than the historic discount levels of 10 and 15%. Much evidence has been heard about the importance of tourism to Purbeck and the need to continue to attract tourists to the local economy, in particular day trippers. There is thus attention in setting the tolls. Other ferry companies, which are not usually comparable, have provided higher discounts with much higher single tickets. In the present case, the only way the higher discounts than proposed could be afforded would be by increasing the single ticket prices. As such, there is a real risk of any measure being counterproductive. Of course, there is no one correct balance to be struck between setting the full fare versus the level of discount, but the company has proposed the revised discounts. It is taken on board, having taken on board, having taken on board the concerns of the local population, while also bearing in mind its knowledge of the customer base and importance of continuing to attract tourists. The company is the most informed and experienced position to make this analysis of all the witnesses the inspector has heard from, and its positioning of the price is reasonable. Some concern was expressed that the toll charge may be sufficient to deter passengers, which it was said would be counterproductive. There is no doubt that there may be a number of anecdotal accounts about that, but any more rigorous or less anecdotal evidence does not bear up. Mr. Keane gave evidence in relation to the period in 2019 when there was in effect a double discount, during which all the bulk discount percentage discounts were doubled. Following resumption of service after the dry shaft issue, he said that having in place, in effect, much lower prices for the tickets led to a lot of people bulk buying tickets in advance to use later. This was before the 2-year expiry was introduced. However, it did not lead to greater passenger volume numbers. In other words, the passengers who would always have travelled on the ferry still travelled on the ferry. They just bought tickets in advance and for less expense. More recently, it can be seen that even keeping tolls costs well below inflation and with higher bulk purchase discounts has not resulted in an increase in passenger numbers, even as the tolls grew increasingly out of step with inflation. That is to say, inflation grows more quickly than the tolls. As such, even when the tolls were set at what has proved and can be seen by all to be an unaffordably low level, since it would not permit a new ferry to be bought absent large increases in traffic volume, it has not driven up passenger numbers. As such, there is simply no evidence that a lower toll would drive up passenger numbers and be financially sustainable, and there's no good evidence to suggest that passenger numbers may be likely to be influenced by factors other than cost. There is good evidence to suggest that passenger numbers may be likely to be influenced by factors other than cost. So, for example, changes in lifestyle and work arrangements post-COVID. In addition, while several people suggested in their opinion that they thought it was cheaper to drive around the longer route rather than take the ferry, no one has quibbled with the accuracy of Mr. Thomas's exhibited calculations derived from the RAC that show that the ferry remains cheaper than driving around for all except for the covers with the very smallest of engines as set out there. Perhaps more can be done in relation to promoting this fact, but it is something that the company has made known to all during this inquiry, and it is submitted may not be taken into account by all drivers, but will be borne in mind by many who appreciate that miles on the clock do cost money, even if that cost is less apparent than the cost of fuel. Moreover, there's a significant time-saving cost. It is notable that Mr. Dubin has set out at some length before the witness evidence that has been submitted, setting out the financial impact in relation to each witness, such as the calculations of Mrs. Amber Hutchinson. But it is clear that, to take that example, all of her calculations are based upon the original application rather than the revised application with its much greater discounts. As such, when reviewing that and similar evidence, the inspector should bear in mind that whereas significantly lower discounts were set out in the original application. The revised application proposes discounts of 24 and 28%. Mrs. Hutchinson's total also clearly includes a significant component for use of the ferry road. Mrs. Hutchinson has provided the company with her address, and the ferry road believes that she would qualify for the exemption provided her car was registered to that address, being within 5 miles of the BH20 postcode. Finally, evidence was heard about pedestrians and cyclist charges. Sorry, I should say on that point, it may be said, well, there may be other people who fall outside of that radius. The reason why the line has been drawn at 5 miles as it has is because the company has reflected on access to other suitable beaches and shorelines. And for example, in Cork Castle, there is good and ready access to other suitable shorelines. And that seems a fair basis for distinguishing them. Finally, evidence was heard about pedestrians and cyclist charges. The company has explained why it's increased these charges, as they have been held at the same level since 2009, and it was not felt to be fair to other users, since it meant in real terms that these costs have gone down very significantly across the period. 1.75 today is simply the real value of 1 in 2009. The company stands by these increases, armed as they are, with significantly improved discounts as being fair to all in the round. They are not injurious to environmental considerations, since there is a need to consider the environmental benefit of the ferry service's continuity, given it removes so many cars from the road. Moreover, there is reason to question whether at least a significant proportion of the foot passengers are really travelling in an environmentally sensitive way, rather than, as I said, to be very common, parking at one side of the road and crossing as a foot passenger for the price saving. So just pausing there as an aside, the Minister can accept or refuse an application, but can also vary it. The ferry company have proposed a package of revisions designed to meet the statutory considerations. However, there was particular heat on the proposed increase to 1.75 from various witnesses and objectors. The company does not propose this, and wishes to make clear does not propose this, but simply wishes to provide information that if the inspector considers that inflationary increases should only be applied since the last inquiry, then the starting base rate would be 1.18 rather than 1.75. However, if the inspector or minister felt it sensible to vary the application in that way, vary the order as against the application in that way, then the company would ask both to consider applying the original levels of discount, i.e. that which currently applies in the 2021 order, which is 10 or 15%, rather than increasing the base rate, but then also increasing the discounts, which would somewhat undo the whole point. Conclusions. And sorry, I've been clear, that's not what we're seeking, that's not what the company is seeking, but it's just setting up the option. I should also make clear that doing so would result in revenues being significantly lower across the period. So it does not come without any cost, because of the real cost. For all the reasons stated above, it is clear that this application is necessary. Absent some interventions in the form of dramatically increased traffic volumes, the alternative is that the ferry will not be capable of being bought in 2034. There is unchallenged evidence before the inspector that this is the case under the 2021 order. The applicant says there is no evidence to cause the inspector or minister to conclude it is likely there will be such an increase in passenger numbers given it would go against all the reason relevant data. Moreover, action is needed now, otherwise the FRR shortfall will only grow, meaning there will be a bigger problem to deal with and less time to deal with it. The applicant has shown through its evidence that even if the application was granted and the unexpected happened and there was an unlikely dramatic increase in traffic volumes, this would not result in it receiving revenue that was more than adequate to meet the financial considerations set out in the statute. Still less, it would be likely to receive revenue that was substantially more than needed to meet these considerations. For all these reasons, it retrospectively submitted that the application should be approved. It is necessary, it is no more than adequate to secure the future of the ferry service. There would simply be no evidential basis to conclude that it was likely to be substantially more than adequate to meet those ends. So those are the main submissions there. I then set out an appendix A, submissions about the road. I'm just going to deal with Mr. Dubin's points as he's addressed you in that way. You've got all the rest of that. The ferry company wanted you to have all of the details so that you felt fully conversant in the law. But I respectfully agree with Mr. Dubin that you certainly need to team yourself with just having this background. So the consortium submissions in relation to the RTRA. The consortium has submitted that the imposition of a toll on the ferry road may cause ferry road to cease to be a road to which the public has access within the meaning of the 1984 Act. The consortium do not say that this would be the effect of imposing the toll, but that it may be. However, the consortium's concerns are misplaced and based on an incorrect reading of the Bowen case. The consortium's reading goes well beyond the principle of the judgment in that case. In his opening statement for the consortium, Mr. Dubin stated, "A road will be a road to which the public has access, provided that the general public do, as a matter of fact, exercise access to it, and provided that those members of the public have not obtained access by overcoming a physical obstruction or in defiance of prohibition expressed or implied." The inquiry is essentially a factual one. That much can be agreed with, because that is what the court found in Bowen. However, where Mr. Dubin and the consortium goes wrong is that he completes the charging of a toll to access. However, where Mr. Dubin and the consortium goes wrong is that he completes the charging of a toll to access a road with a prohibition on accessing the road. This is wrong. Rendering access conditional and the payment of a toll is not a prohibition, either express or implied. This can be appreciated from the 1923 Act itself, which both permits the ferry company to, both requires the ferry company to permit the public to access the road, but also permits the ferry company to charge tolls to access it. By Section 51 of the 1923 Act, the company is required to make the road available for the public upon payment of tolls and compliance with the regulation and bylaws for the time being. Hence, the company is not permitted to prohibit anyone expressly or impliedly from accessing the road, but must make it available to everyone paying the toll. The case of Bowen concerned the question of whether a private road was or was not a road under the 1984 Act. It was a road on private land that was routinely used by members of the public, even though legally they had no entitlement to use it. The judge found that it was a road since, as a matter of fact, the public used it and access to it was not physically obstructed or prohibited. That case does not concern, and it is submitted has nothing to say about the charging of tolls on roads. Mr. Dubin cites no case law to support the suggestion that the mere requirement to pay a toll or fulfill any other condition before access to a road is granted amounts to a prohibition on access to the road. Mr. Dubin's reading of the case is in fact a rather extreme overextension that would be unworkable in practice. The fundamental point is that the fulfillment of a condition such as the payment of a toll before accessing a road does not amount to a prohibition on access to the road. Clearly, there are all manner of conditions that must be fulfilled before drivers are permitted to access any road regulated by the RTRA 1994. For start, the road car must be insured, the driver must have a license, they must pay road tax. The requirement that these conditions must be fulfilled before a car is used on every publicly accessible road in this country does not amount to a prohibition, not amount to a prohibition on access to those roads. Neither does the requirement to pay a toll amount to a prohibition on access to the ferry road. Mr. Dubin suggests interpretation of Bowen would have very surprising consequences. This might arise most dramatically in the case of the London congestion charge. That must be paid to access most of central London's roads. Does that charge amount to an implied prohibition on access to those roads, such that all of the roads of central London are not roads under the 1984 Act? If so, it would mean that London local authorities, London local authorities would not be able to impose the road to traffic restriction orders otherwise applying on those roads. The same would be true for every toll road, bridge and tunnel in this country. Such a result cannot be correct. It does not follow from any fair reading of Bowen. Further, it's instructive to consider the nature of the toll in this case, which is not a toll on simple access to the road, but rather a toll on certain kinds of use of the ferry road, namely a toll for being stationary on the road for more than 30 consecutive minutes within one calendar day. The Consortium's case appears to be that even this may amount to a prohibition on access to the road. That would mean that any road in respect of which a charge is levied for stopping for more than 30 minutes would cease to be a road. Yet that plainly applies in respect of many roads in our towns and cities where there is a charge for stopping for more than 30 minutes. This is a charge for parking on the side. It is notable in Bowen that the High Court rejected the arguments of the local authority that the road was not a road in the statutory sense because at 5, those arguments would introduce unnecessary complexity into decisions that need to be made regularly. According to Mr. Dubin's interpretation, judges would have to consider whether a toll might cause the public to be dissuaded from using the road. And he says that if they conclude this, then it should be treated as an implied prohibition. Such an inquiry on the part of judges would be completely unworkable. In short, the levying of a charge for certain uses of the road does not amount to a prohibition on access to the road. The requirement to pay a toll is conditional on accessing the road. The condition is quite distinct from a prohibition. The 1923 Act sets out both the right of the public to access the roads and the levying of a toll. The two are entirely compatible. So those are my submissions in response to those of the consortium in relation to the road. You have the remainder of my submissions on the other miscellaneous points. Yes, I'm reminded about the human rights point. You've got submissions addressing Mr. Slow right at the very back of my submissions, which is the appendix has it's a paragraph number, it's 2021 and 22 of the appendix. And that's just to say that Mr. Dubin in his closing made what I understood to be in his part a new point about impact assessments, which he has not raised insofar as his mind indicates, certainly didn't raise in opening or in questioning. As will be appreciated, the requirements imposed upon the local authority, to which he referred to as the public body, under the Human Rights Act or other applicable legislation, do not apply to private companies such as the company, the ferry company, in Section 6, Human Rights Act 1998. I also note that this point is raised extremely late, but I can press that point further. It wasn't clear in fairness the extent to which Mr. Dubin pressed the point or whether he was just raising it in passing. So I just wanted to address that to tie off that point in relation to Mr. Slow. So if I can assist you further.
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Yes, would it assist you to have the previous inspector's reports uploaded to the website? I was suspecting you could access it yourself if you wanted to. But very happy to provide them.
I think there would be merit in having those, so others can see them as well.
Yes,
So we've got Inspector Vice per the report, but it's the ones previous to that.
The two previous to that.
Yeah. Thank you. So, thank you both for your closing submissions. Are there any other matters to be raised before I close?
Sorry, sir, I didn't address the side miscellaneous points. What the company says about the side letter point is that sections 78 and 79 of the 1923 Act empower the company to charge tolls not exceeding the sums mentioned in the schedules. Again, schedules originally to that Act. The 1956 Act then provides the Minister a power to vary, that is, it refers back to the tolls that may be levied under the originating legislation. So the power to vary relates to the maximum tolls and in relation to certain classes of vehicle. It is not clear to the ferry company that the various proposed exemptions, conditions, while they may go to the cost paid by certain persons, it's not clear that they relate to the maximum toll that may be levied in relation to certain classes of passenger. So it doesn't relate to maximum tolls and classes of passenger, but rather other slightly more bespoke things. And there was concern that including it in the statutory instrument would risk going on to barriers beyond the statutory power. And so to avoid that unwelcome scenario, unwelcome for everyone, put in the side letter. But I would endorse Mr. Dubin's comments that the undertaking is a document, an agreement of real weight, which it would be virtually impossible to depart from. It is a formal and public undertaking to the Secretary of State. So that's my points in the hand.
Got that. Thank you very much. So at that point, can I thank everyone for their contributions and for the constructive way in which the inquiry has been conducted, and that